Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Cooper Quinton, and I'm a senior staff technologist at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. I'll be the moderator for today's discussion. A few housekeeping things first. We'll be recording this session, and only video of our speakers will be included. You can join us now in the official chat via Twitch at eff.org/livestream. Please feel free to drop your questions into the chat throughout the program, and our guests will answer as many as they can at the end. And if you're comfortable, you can type a little hello in the chat window now and let us know what part of the world you're coming from. With that out of the way, welcome to Affecting Change, EFF's new live stream series covering some of the biggest topics in digital privacy and free speech. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Electronic Frontier Foundation, EFF is a nonprofit whose technologists, activists, and attorneys have been fighting for your online privacy and free speech since 1990. You are the reason that EFF can take on this important work. So if you'd like to help us in the fight to defend your digital freedoms, please consider donating at eff.org/affectingchange. And with that, I'd like to welcome our speakers. Thorin Klosowski from EFF, Gilo Kutrupi from Greenpeace, and Eva Galprin, also from EFF. Thanks for joining us, you all. Today, we're going to discuss digital security for protesters. We'll touch on what sorts of threats to digital security protesters should look out for, what you can do before the protest to prepare, and how to protect yourself during and after the protest. And without further ado, I want to turn it to the panel. My first question, and this can be for any of you, is what are the main threats that people should be concerned with if they're going to a protest, either in the US or abroad? And what technologies should people consider in their threat modeling?
Well, I guess I can get the ball rolling on this one, since we were talking about this a little bit earlier. So the first thing that I'd like to make clear to everybody here is that not all protests are the same. And not everyone's experience at a protest is the same. So the first thing that you need to really think about is what kind of protest are you going to? What are you planning to do? How likely is it that you are going to be arrested, or you are going to be tear gassed, or you are going to be identified and then harassed by pro-government actors or law enforcement or even non-government actors that simply are watching the protest and opposed to whatever it is that you're doing. So those are some of the possible threats. I like to describe going to a protest a little bit like, sort of preparing yourself for a protest a little bit like preparing yourself to go on a hike. Sometimes your hike is a nice little kind of uphill walk that you're taking in the afternoon, and you need to bring some water and a snack and comfortable shoes. And sometimes you are about to go summit Mount Everest, and you are going to need to prepare yourself a little bit differently. So some of the kinds of challenges that you may face, it may include seizure of your electronic devices, or arrest, or identification, or even physical violence, tracking of the people with whom you are organizing whatever it is that you are doing, or the people who are talking to the people that you are organizing with. So that's enough to sort of get us started, and I may leave it to the rest to talk about the sort of specifics of what kind of electronic devices you may be bringing with you and what you might want to do to them.
I just pitch in 1 second on the different types of protests here, because beside the different types, there is also the geography, which is very important. Many of you know that the threat model of someone who is an investigative journalist in Zimbabwe is completely different than a Greenpeace activist in Holland, let's say. There are always risks. That's why I think we also mentioned the issue of the risk assessments, but I think it's important to make that analysis and never generalize that the protest should be approached in the same way wherever you are, because the actors are different, the participants are different. And by the way, the technology that might be against us or against the people who protest is also different. The levels of surveillance change all the time, and I'm glad that Eva is gonna start to mention tools and things, which of course we have to adopt, and we have to ask activists to adopt according to what are the main threats in terms of technological adversaries.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to look back, especially at EFF's first guides on protests, and kind of see how we've evolved and how we talk about this, how we recommend things, like building on a lot of what Bill Buddington had done originally. It's interesting to see what we used to recommend that was like very prescriptive. Put this, like, here's your device. We know that these things are happening. Now it is different by where you are. It's, you know, what your threat model might be. It is helping you approach what you are worried about, and then providing you with resources to know what your city might have or where you're at. Atlas of Surveillance has a lot of that. We know that, you know, there's body cameras, there are drones, there are cell site simulators, and our devices are sharing a lot of that information, but not everywhere, not for everyone. And that's not a model that everyone needs to consider. So yeah, I think we know so much more in the last even just years, and being able to cater a lot of like what you need to where you're at is really important.
And Eva, to expand on this topic a little bit, what is your best sort of general advice if somebody asks you how best they can protect themselves and their allies, digital security and safety? And you know, if your advice is threat modeling, can you expound a little more on what that is and how people can do it? And then is that advice different inside the US or, you know, versus outside for people in other countries? And is it the same for everybody in the US?
Well, so one of the interesting things about the history of EFF's advice to activists and journalists and people who are going to protests is that we used to have it divided up into sort of two categories, and one was sort of like EFF inside of the US, and the other was international. And this is just like the worst example of dividing the world up into the West and the rest. And the assumption behind it was that in the US, we could tell you a little bit about what the law is, and you might even be protected by certain laws. And then outside of the US, all of our advice was essentially on the assumption that all legal protections are not working. All bets are off. So let's just talk about the sort of electronic protections or the physical protections or the digital protections that you can arrange. We have long since given up this distinction, and I think that that's really important. And in fact, when I give advice to people who are attending protests, I generally tell them not to rely too heavily on their legal protections, and to just start with your, with protecting your data, assuming that the law will fail you in every way. And I think that that's sort of a safe a safe way of approaching risk. Obviously, not the same everywhere. There are situations in which people will want to bring their phones to protests, for example. And if you bring your phone to your protest, you need to keep in mind that it is possible that your phone will be seized when you are arrested, or if you are questioned, that it will be analyzed by government, that your presence at the protest will be known to people who control cell site simulators, or people who are able to ask your ISP or your telco about who was connecting to the cell sites near the protest at the time that the protest was going on. You can assume that your physical location in the immediate vicinity of the protest may be being tracked. In many cases, you may assume that some sort of facial recognition technology is being employed, either by governments and law enforcement, but also, again, by private organizations and groups that may be targeting the protesters for harassment. This is really one of the big things that we have seen in, I would say, the last 6 or 7 years since the kind of since it became much more common and easy to do facial recognition at scale. We have definitely seen it used as a way of identifying protesters. So not only is masking great as a way to keep each other from getting sick, it is also a pretty good way of making it more difficult to identify yourself. Having said that, masking is not sufficient. We've definitely seen cases in which there was a famous case a few years ago in which a protester was identified because she had bought a specific shirt on Etsy. So be careful about your tattoos and blue hair and identifying markers, things along those lines, if you're trying to preserve your identity. And then I would also consider just the tools that you are using to organize before you go to the protest, to communicate with your fellow protesters, to make your plans about what it is you're going to do, about where you're going to meet, especially if you're engaged in a direct action. And I think Thorin can talk a little bit more about this, but the most important aspect of risk assessment there is making sure that your planning is either being done through end-to-end encrypted communications, or using or being very careful about the platforms that you are using, and that you are making your plans with the understanding that it is possible for governments or law enforcement to send a subpoena or a warrant to those platforms in order to get the contents of your communications.
I also would like to stress one element which we don't discuss much, but is we always talk about our own devices, or anyway, the devices of the protesters. But we always have to ask, hey, what is in this device? Am I putting at risk other people? How many phone numbers I have on my phone? Because sometimes maybe we go and attend the protest on the sideline, for example, but at the same time, we have on our phone details and mails and chats for someone who is in the middle of the action. So someone who is more exposed and maybe more vulnerable. So I always stress whenever I talk to activists that this mindset of saying is not just about your own things, your own information you want to protect, but actually it's a lot of duty of care in protecting your fellow activists or the others that are near you. Because if indeed the device is taken, maybe you say, I don't have much on my device, but you do have those phone numbers. You do have exchanges. And of course, nobody is super brave enough to say, I'm not going to unlock my computer. As you know, if there is someone coming and say, you unlock the computer, you're going to unlock the computer and the phone. So those chats, unfortunately, will be there. But yes, end-to-end encryption allows us also to do disappearing messages, for example, so that during the process is very useful. In a few minutes, everything is there, even if the device is confiscated. I think that's really important. And by the way, associated to this and the risk assessment topic that Eva raised, there is also the issue of having an approach to security, as we like to call it, integrated security or holistic security, because you will not be prepared to protect your devices if you're not mentally equipped to be there and if you don't feel safe. And like this is a whole process of making sure that your logistics are in place, your psychosocial support is in place, because then when your mind is free from all these other concerns, then you can think about your devices and the other technology part.
Yeah, I think having your devices kind of ready to go, having all of, disappearing messages on, using an end-to-end encrypted chat apps, it sets the baseline for what you're doing at a much higher level, that when you do go into this situation that, let's be honest, it can go in many different directions. When you're there, kind of regardless of what you're doing, regardless of what the protest is about, it can go bad, it can go wrong. If you feel like you are just on the sidelines, that doesn't mean you will not be arrested. It doesn't mean you won't, have to hand over your phone. And all of your contacts, all of that is there. So I think preparing all of that ahead of time gives you a peace of mind to know that you know what to do and you have an action plan, and you can know that you've protected yourself and your devices as best as possible.
Sorry, I was having trouble finding the unmute button. Gilo, I want to touch on something that you just spoke about. I want to go back to that. So Greenpeace coordinates a lot of large-scale actions all over the world. And could you talk a bit more about what strategies that you all use to safeguard sensitive information about protest plans, participant lists, activist networks in regions where environmental defenders have been targeted or with violence or legal prosecution, which is probably every region, now that I think about it.
Yes, it is unfortunately every region. So it depends because as you know, Greenpeace is a large organization and we have our own infrastructure. So we have our great IT departments that help us already protecting it. But many times we work with volunteers, for example, right? Most of our activists actually are volunteers, which means they are usually not part of our IT infrastructure. And we often work also with partners, partner organizations. We work with movements and we do actions with them. So what we actually started trying to do is to find the basic tools that everybody can adopt that, of course, try to focus on open source, because what we're going to do, things that can be can have independent security audits, but in a way that are a low-hanging fruit in terms of security and privacy, and everybody can adopt. Because also there is no time to train people. In the past, when we were doing it with a few activists, hey, for example, for those of you who know, so let's work on PGP. But when you organize an action which is in different parts of the world, and this is, hey, let's learn PGP, there is no way. So nowadays, unfortunately, you have to go way low with the basics. Luckily, I would say that secure messaging is really the low-hanging fruit nowadays and allow us to do several things, which is a shame for technologists, of course, because we love to encrypt everything in all the possible ways. But we also have to consider that we need a baseline, because in some countries, as you were saying, it's kind of different. Technology works in a place in a different way. So we really have to give the things that are most affordable. Not everybody has iPhones, not everybody has this. They're easy to use. They can be a young activist or it can be a senior activist. And that's something that more and more when we support activists, we are trying to do. We're also recommending usually platforms that we've been using for long in information security movement, like CryptPad, for example. All tools that they can access and to guarantee their security and privacy. There is a lot of preparation, as Torin was saying. Like this is not just on the spot. Like when the action happens, then you're just making sure that everything goes smoothly. And then, of course, you prepare for the worst or the best, which can happen afterwards. What if devices are confiscated? What if people are arrested? What if? So you have a very long period of preparation beforehand to make sure that all the cogs are in place and in motion. And then you're actually there ready for, let's say, the aftermath. During the protests themselves, you only want to make sure that everybody's in touch with each other. There is a buddy system so that everybody knows where someone else is always in place. And again, it all boils down to that duty of care we were mentioning before. We want everybody, at the end of the day, we want everybody to be safe. So in general, probably if there is one common thread of all the actions is that it's a movement, it's everybody, it's all together. There is no someone going rogue because can expose themselves, can expose other people. So coordination is usually quite important.
To add to that, and this can be for any of you, should people only care about digital security when they're getting ready for a protest or during the protest? Or is it important to always practice digital security? Why don't you go ahead and respond?
Thorin, go for it.
I would say it is always important to practice digital security. And a lot of the stuff is really it's the building blocks that make everything else easier. Kind of when you're in the habit of communicating on Signal or Just using a lot of these tools, it just makes, and your phone's already encrypted, you have the passcode. It just makes, a lot of this easier, I think, especially for like a protest that maybe is happening tomorrow that wasn't planned. That's, some of these things are planned out, but sometimes they just happen. So.
But also, if you are, I think, in the NGO world, or even if there is not an action now, there will be an activity in a month or in 2 months and in 3 months. And you have those conversations on your phone. You are having those calls with activists. So you are accumulating a lot of confidential information that at this moment in time, maybe it's not at risk, but you might end up in a situation where it is at risk. And by the way, in many countries, even in Europe, recently with environmental activists, houses got raided by the authorities. And I'm not talking about areas where there is a regime. I'm talking about Germany, I'm talking about France. And so activists had all their devices, like they thought, hey, everything is okay, they are home, no problem. Maybe I don't need to protect them because you think it's a safe environment. But actually, the risk for anybody working in the NGO movement, unfortunately, is always there. So, yeah, preparedness at all times, Cooper, not just during the moment of the action.
I'm not a big fan of the military, but there's a military axiom here, which I think is useful, which is that during times of crisis, during times of stress, people revert to their most basic level of training. And I think that that's another reason why it's important to practice these things every day, so that when you're in the middle of a protest, tear gas is flying by you or whatever, or you're running from police, you don't want to revert to a level of no security, right? You want to have all these things in place so that you don't have to think about them. They're just kind of automatic when the time comes. Thorin, sticking with you for a second, you've been following the campus protests for Palestine pretty closely. And I wanted to ask you, how do those protests differ from what we might think of as traditional protests in the US? And are there different steps and considerations that you think students should consider when they're protesting on their campuses?
Yeah, I think they are very different for a few reasons. I'm going to use a video game analogy that might not land for everybody, but whatever, I'm going to run with it. If we're looking at protests and protest movements in general, we can call that like an open world where like anything can happen. You can, there's a lot of different variables. There's different situations and everywhere. With a lot of the campus protests, one, they're encampments, so they're staying put. Two, they're in this small enclosed environment where a lot is known about everyone who is there. So there's ID cards. There's ID cards that are getting swiped, to get in and out of buildings. There's Wi-Fi that everyone has access to. Everyone's face is already in a database with their student IDs. It's just everything is kind of known about everyone who is there. So your threat model is kind of completely different because you are interacting with an entity that knows everything about you that there is to know already. And it's very easy to track who you are and if you are at somewhere. So I think preparing for that is you kind of just have to accept that everything is accessible. You might have, school edu addresses, or your laptop might be, tapped into different parts of the, Google Docs or whatever that is owned by the institution. It's just all these different things you have to think through based on the fact that you are a very well-known individual in that area.
Cooper, I think you're muted.
I sure am. That mute button is going to be the death of me. For the rest of the panel, are there other specific types of protests that you think are interesting and have interesting specific threat models that you want to touch on for our listeners here?
Eva?
Sorry, my internet has been deeply uncooperative. So I think that there are a couple of different forms of protest that are worth talking about that we haven't touched on. The first is that not all protests happen in person. There's also a lot of activism that happens over social media. And I think we have, for some strange reason, been kind of working around that. And sometimes these happen in sort of in tandem with protests happening in physical reality, and sometimes they are happening entirely on their own. Just the phenomenon of having hashtags trend and all of that stuff was really what the about 10, 12 years ago, kind of the birth of this whole idea of online activism. A lot of online activism happens as a result of filming things that are happening on the ground and then making them available to everyone. Doing analysis of other people's film, doing kind of going here's what all of this means, or here's who is in this video, or here's how many people there are at this thing. And so I think it's really important to be aware of a couple of different things. The first is that if you are filming people at a protest and then you are going to make that video available, understand that the people who are being filmed are easily identifiable via readily available facial recognition technology. And even if facial recognition technology is not enough, that if it is being seen by enough eyes, somebody will recognize the person in the video. Sometimes that's the point, but sometimes you are accidentally narking on your own people. Signal, I think, has a blur tool that you can use in order to blur out people's faces when you are sharing video or when you're sharing pictures. And I think that is a really important thing to keep in mind, and generally not to share other people's faces or images without their permission or consent, unless that's kind of the point, like you are filming a protest of people that you are deeply opposed to and you are in fact looking to identify them. But also understand when you are protesting that there will be people who are doing this to you.
There is something similar to that. We realized a few years ago, this happened in Egypt at the COP climate conference. Activists had their phones, had authorities started taking photos of activist phones, and they posted the authorities on the internet, on social media, the chats that activists were actually having on their phones. Since then, we actually started recommending a lot the usage of privacy screens, because basically that's the only way, right? Unless someone is really facing directly on the phone. But there was very invasive, and you do your best, of course, even if you put disappearing messages, but if you have someone behind you, and for me, stuff like shoulder surfing, unfortunately, is one of the biggest threats. We try to be always very high tech, but at the end of the day, like old-fashioned social engineering always works. And that's why like simple tools, again, like privacy screens, unfortunately, it's not free, because I know that we try to make security and privacy as affordable to everybody. This is one of those things you have to purchase. But I strongly recommend everybody who goes on the street or does any kind of activity to always have privacy screens.
And back to Eva, I feel like we've actually skipped a very important step here, which is threat modeling or risk assessment. And I know that this is something that you have spent years trying to get digital security trainers and the people being trained to understand as a foundational part of digital security. Can you talk a bit about what threat modeling is and what sort of steps one should take?
So if you look at EFF's Surveillance Self-Defense Guide, you will look around and you will see that there is not a section on a thing called threat modeling. There used to be, But one of the things that we discovered over our many years of outreach to communities is that there is sort of a subset of the communities that we are looking to engage that are really put off by the term threat modeling. And so we moved away from threat modeling to understanding your risks. So I am going to talk about this as threat modeling, but please understand that if you go to SSD, that you should go and look for things like risk assessment. We do, in fact, have a section all about this on SSD, recently updated by Thorin. And the entire point of this sort of understanding your risks is that trying to protect everything from everybody all the time is impossible, and also is a really good way to drive yourself crazy. And so before you go to the protest, or indeed before you do anything else, you should think about, what am I trying to protect? Who am I trying to protect it from? What are the capabilities of this person or threat that what might happen? What might they do? And sort of like, what is the worst case scenario if they are successful and I failed to protect the things that I need to protect from the people that I need to protect it from? It turns out that this sounds very intimidating, but it's actually the kind of thing that we do every day. If you are in a city in the United States and you are driving somewhere and you are deciding where to park your car, and whether or not to leave things in the car, and whether or not to lock the car. This is all threat modeling. You're thinking about, where is a safe place to leave my car? Is someone likely to break into my car? Are they more likely to break into my car if they can see that there are things inside of the car that are of value, or if it is clear that there is nothing of value in the car? What are the chances that I will be attacked on the way to the car? Maybe I want to make sure that I am parked in a place which is well lit, or where there are other people, or where there are other things that are more likely to make me safe. Are there signs indicating that that this is a no parking zone? Am I going to, the other kind of threat that I can possibly have is that the DPW will come and tow my car away, or will leave me a ticket, and then my bad outcome will be that I will have to pay an enormous fine. So this is the sort of thing that we do every single day. And the difference is that we have to do it with our digital information. The reason why this is much harder to do with digital information than it is with your car and your stuff and the signs around the car and the stuff is that we don't always understand where our data is located. So we don't always know where our stuff is, who may be able to see it or take it, and what they might be able to do with it. And that is really where EFF's expertise comes in. That's one of the reasons why surveillance self-defense is so comprehensive and talks about so many different kinds of technologies and so many different things that might go wrong. It is to help you kind of zero in on the problem that you specifically have. And one of the big problems that we have is that there's a lot of kind of mythology around what is safe and what is not safe. And some of it is accurate. We, for example, talk about cell site simulators and the way that governments and law enforcement can spy on the location of your cell phone or the text messages that you are sending. But some of it is largely mythology. I have spent the last several months talking about Telegram, mostly protesters and activists who organize via channels and groups on Telegram under the mistaken impression that their communications are safe because they are end-to-end encrypted, which incidentally they are not, and people who are having group chats of like 2 or 3 people on Telegram who, again, believe that these chats are end-to-end encrypted and safe, and indeed more safe than something like Signal or WhatsApp, where all of your communications are end-to-end encrypted by default. And this is directly a result of misleading statements by Pavel Durov meant to undermine actually safe platforms in order to move people onto his platform, which is profoundly unsafe if you want to make sure that the contents of your communications are not available to Pavel Durov, Telegram, and any government that can bully him, such as the French government, which recently arrested him, and he is currently unable to leave France.
Can you also make sure that people have to be wary of any new platforms that might come in? Like, no one of us trusts Elon Musk, but there is this thing that says, "Hey, Twitter will become end-to-end encrypted. You will be able to use it like you use WhatsApp." No. So let's try to demystify several things here, because unfortunately, all these news come one after the other. And from my perspective, I always say to people, as long as there are regular independent security audits, as long as groups, for example, like EFF and others, Access Now, for example, Frontline Defenders, like they recommend these pieces of technology, then that's fine. But unfortunately, if you just go around and look at Reddit or other places, that's you might end up in a bad place.
There's also kind of funny or interesting myths. As a weirdo who goes into the settings for everything, I think about airplane mode a lot, and kind of thinking of like the car and you lock the door and you see the lock go down. Airplane mode felt like that for a lot of people. It's like you click the thing, it turns off all of the stuff. It shouldn't be collecting anything. And over time, we've kind of realized that like, oh, maybe location still is getting collected by apps in the background, or it's, it just waits to upload all of that when it's done. And it's one of those things that it just evolves over time. And, something that is a myth might have been a fact at one point or vice versa. And it's just kind of that trick of keeping up to date on a lot of this is a pain in the butt often.
Speaking of that, how can people keep up with the latest digital security advice or learn more about this topic if they want to take a deeper dive into the things we've discussed today? What do you all use to keep up with, and what do you recommend?
Besides following Eva's feeds, like I think that is a great start. But jokes aside, like I think there are a number of very skilled people in the sector, and Torin and the EFF in general. I mentioned before also Access Now and Frontline Defenders. These are all groups that have been doing information security work for a long time. And usually, like following those feeds, if you want, I mean, it can, because many of them now are on Mastodon or still on Twitter. Usually, the advice is always there. Then I guess it's difficult because keeping up to date with these things and the news. Like I personally, if you ask me personally, I reverted back to RSS feeds, and I have like 150 RSS channels that I'm following, and I am using Discord more, but because there are now very interesting Discord servers, like the one from Bellingcat, for example, where they also discuss about information security. So there are different. Reddit might be, but that's a bit of a mess. So I don't know. That's my approach anyway.
Same. I love RSS feeds, and I've also recently gone back to them, and I think everybody should. It's such a better way to browse the internet. Thorin, do you happen to work on a specific resource that might be helpful here?
Yeah, although I don't think we have an RSS feed for it. But surveillance self-defense is a great resource that we keep updated as often as possible. We also, if there are immediate things that need action or that we are unsure about, just the EFF blog will have a lot of that if it's something that we need to respond to quickly. But surveillance self-defense will have a lot of your questions about a lot of this answered.
Great. Eva, do you have something
I've
to
got
add here?
a couple of resources
Yes.
to shout out. I have a spider in the middle of a web of security and privacy advice. I spend a lot of time looking at the different resources that are available. I have a special squishy soft spot in my heart for surveillance self-defense. But I would also recommend checking out the Freedom of the Press Foundation's trainings And there are sort of like explanations and breakdowns of various privacy and security issues. And one of the reasons why that's so interesting is because the kinds of privacy and security issues faced by journalists are very similar to the ones faced by activists and protesters. They have the same problems with trying to do their jobs and communicate while also keeping it safe, keeping their data safe from a variety of different attackers. So freedom of the press is really great. If you're doing abortion activism, I recommend the Digital Defense Fund, which has like a really great set of breakdowns of sort of digital defense for people who are doing abortion activism and for people who are seeking abortions. And oh God, what else is a really good
Privacy International
internews?
is also quite good material.
Privacy International has a lot of good material, especially about the kind of technologies that are being used by potential attackers. I also recommend checking out EFF's street level surveillance project, which talks a lot about what kind of technologies are available to governments and to police departments when it comes to spying on journalists and activists and protesters.
I would add one more. If all of this is super overwhelming to you and you're just kind of starting at the very beginning, Consumer Reports' security planner is a great place to start, and it kind of will help give you the building blocks to level up after.
All great resources. So we are going to head into our Q&A portion of this now and take some audience questions. But first, I want to exercise my moderator's privilege and ask you all a question, which is that we've focused a lot on what to do before and during the protest. But I would like it if you all could talk about what you think people should do or consider after the protest, and especially if they've been arrested and are now released. What things people should consider, what additional risks they should plan for.
Well, I can say something. We have to work a lot on this kind of scenarios because most of the times for the types of action we have, there is quite likely an arrest happening. And our activists, for how they organize themselves, they maybe have mobile devices or other tools. We have photographers, for example. We have to consider confiscation facts, basically, because that's the first thing that can come to my mind. Of course, I am not even mentioning the whole making sure that the person is physically safe, making sure that the person is in a good state of mind, that because for us, that is priority. Like that angle comes first, the person has to be safe. Then we can discuss how the devices are involved. Another thing I think that is important is if someone is actually coordinating with someone else, but only one person is arrested, then should check also the others, because they can be, for example, raided afterwards. Others can find information there. And in general, it's still back to preparation, I have to say. But making sure if you have access to legal support, that the devices get back to you. But depends also where you are, because in some contexts, if authorities take my device and they give it back to me, I wouldn't trust the device. Well, probably nowadays in most, but I would consider a device compromised. And we all know that there are groups doing forensics on that, and Citizen Lab and Amnesty Tech, but there is proof that unfortunately once devices are taken, that they can be manipulated and things can be put in those. So it's really bad to say, but we often tell activists, hey, depending on the context, it's probably better if you go out there with a burner, or there is something happening. You might be able, like you might have to not use your device, or at least we have to go through forensics because it can be too much at risk. So it's a bit of a sad thing because, of course, if you work with large movement, everybody have their own personal device. There is not an organization device. And losing a phone or losing a laptop, or then it's really horrible. But we have to put this big red flag, because authorities have the power to actually tamper with the devices in a few minutes, literally. So one of the things that is important to do is literally an inventory of everything, all the equipment that you had during the protest, an inventory you had after, who touched it, for how long, and these things. But these are just the small tips, because of course it can be way more comprehensive than that.
On that, so a question from the audience that's relevant here. Is it inadvisable to bring a phone to a demo and to call the people, or a protest, to call the people that you're there with? Would it be better to instead rely on having somewhere to meet up at a specific time, or something in case you get separated? What's your advice here? Thorin.
Yeah, I think that will kind of go back to the sort of threat modeling that we talked about before. That's really going to depend on what your needs are, what you want to get out of it, what you're worried about, and kind of what you have access to. A burner is a great option if you can afford to buy one, and you can go through all those steps. Or maybe you just have a point and shoot camera and a plan. Like it really is just depending on what your needs are, and I think you really have to walk through those questions to be able to answer that for yourself.
I mean, a lot of it is really going to depend on both whether or not you are concerned about being arrested, what kind of information you have, what kind of data you have on your phone, what kind of contacts you have on your phone, how much communication you need with fellow protesters while you are on the ground. This again varies from protest to protest, and it varies depending on what it is that you're trying to achieve. And kind of like what your role in the protest is, whether you are a person whose job it is, or whose goal during the protest is to document it so that other people can see what's going on and become inspired and get the word out. In which case, yeah, you're going to want to bring an electronic device, ideally one that can communicate with the internet, perhaps to a platform where people are already following you, or using some sort of hashtag that will allow people to see what it is that you're doing. Or you could be doing some sort of direct action where your goal is to do the direct action and possibly not get arrested by not being identified and not having people even know what the action is. In which case, yeah, you're probably going to want to make sure that you are not physically trackable, and that there is nothing on you that will identify you if you are arrested or identify the people with whom you are working. So there's a whole range of different kinds of protest that you could be having, and the advice depends very much on that.
Somebody in chat asks, is it common that phones get taken at protests? I figured the police were more focused on safety and dispersion, not tracking people down and obtaining extra information. Is that the case, chat, or do phones commonly get taken at protests?
Well, pretty much. And as I was saying before, like you have to consider it, the more a person is, let's say, on the front line of the action, we say, hey, listen, if there are really a lot of chances that you get arrested, they are going to take your devices. And that's something that happens. Maybe it happens, they are taken and given back after a few minutes. Maybe they are taken and not given back. But as I said, for me, already a few minutes off your site, a device can be considered compromised. So yes, taking devices, it's a very common thing. And not only taking, in some cases, because of biometrics, it's very easy to force you to unlock it. In Russia, they were taking the phones, they had already put them just in the faces of people, and they were face unlocking it. If I'm not mistaken, in the US, the fingerprint is actually part of your ID doesn't, and basically you are enforced to use that. One of the things maybe you want to tell people is to shut the devices down to minimize the risk of access. But yes, unfortunately, mobile phones are a liability, are a comfort, but a liability as well.
Yeah, in the US, some courts have determined that while police cannot force you to enter your password to unlock your phone, they can force you to use biometrics such as your fingerprint or your face to unlock your phone. So for that reason, a good step is to just turn off biometric unlocking if you think there's a chance that you might be arrested. I want to turn a bit to transportation to the protest, and there's a couple of questions here that I think are relevant to this. One is about the invasion of privacy coming from license plate or image reading cameras that are being placed all over public streets. And then the other is the rise in CCTV and personal profiles. What is the recommended mode of transport to an in-person protest? And should people worry about things like license plate readers? And are there other ways that police can track your location?
So again, shout out to street level surveillance. Love it. EFF has a project that specifically tracks the kind of surveillance that you see inside of cities quite regularly, and tracks the use and deployment of facial recognition technology, CCTV cameras, and automated license plate readers. But yes, do keep in mind that if you are driving to the protest, that there is a very good chance that the local police department has cameras on the roads, and that they are using automated license plate readers in order to track which cars are coming to the place of protest in advance of the protest. So public transportation, somebody else's car, walking, bicycling, these are all options. Again, it depends on where the protest is and how important it is to make sure that your identity is not associated with the protest to people who have access to the ALPR information or local cameras.
And let's remember that if your number plate is associated to you and you are associated to the protest, even if you are not arrested in that moment, that will stay in the record for future action that you might take. So your car, maybe not necessarily now at this stage, but in a couple of years' time, will still result connecting to an action. So good idea of just using the bikes and the public transport.
Oh, a quick note about public transport. There are many of the methods of paying for your public transportation are also trackable and identifiable. And so, for example, during the democracy protests in Hong Kong in the last couple of years, there was definitely a big push for people to take public transportation, but also for people to be extremely careful about how they paid for it.
And let's not forget that our phones are also, of course, personal tracking devices that we carry on us 24/7. On that, let's take another question from chat. On a different topic here, actually, if protests and activism happen online, as we were discussing earlier, or often planning for them happens online, are we providing big tech with the data to profile activists and identify target groups for that benefit big players or authorities with lots of money? And how can we, to rephrase that a little bit, when we are organizing our activism online, are we providing big data with the information that can then be used to target us?
Of course. Like I would not, I strongly recommend people to not organize themselves on big platforms, because there is not one that I would trust at this stage where data is not passed on to governments or something. So especially most of them are US based, so very easy to subpoena comparing, for example, European companies. And yeah, so if people plan to organize something online, please don't. But having said that, there are a lot of small tech groups that are also behind hosting companies and are very privacy friendly. You can discuss it. There are still a lot of mailing lists going on that are more private than organizing on a Facebook group, for example, which happens, unfortunately.
I'm going to push back on this. I'm going to be controversial. So again, it depends on what you are doing. There are situations in which you want to do your organizing in a way that is extremely secure and that does not touch any of the big companies, or that if it does touch the big companies, does it in a way that is anonymized, say via Tor. Or where your communications are end-to-end encrypted so that they do not have the contents of your communications. But in the end, activism is about reaching people. So there are some aspects that you may want to do secretly, but in the end, you want people to know what you did. You want to be able to talk to other human beings. And in order to do that, you're going to have to use the large platforms. You're going to have to use Facebook and Instagram and TikTok and everything else. And I don't want to scare protesters so much that they forget to do activism. Or that they feel like they can't do activism because it is too dangerous. In the end, the whole point of activism is to reach large groups of people. But the point of operational security is to separate the very sensitive things that you are doing when you are organizing from the reaching out to people, contacting them, and telling them about the thing that you have already done.
Yeah, I think also it's important to differentiate promoting an activity and organizing an activity. So these are quite two different things. And in many cases, organizing doesn't really happen on the mainstream channels anyway. It happens, the pure organizing happens on Signal, via Tor and others. But the promotion, it definitely has to be there. Otherwise, you will not have participation, you will not have visibility. So, and I think that all the movements are slowly improving the way they use social media, mainstream media, to promote protests. But yeah, the organizing part is a bit more hidden as it should be. Otherwise, it would be compromised.
But I will add that, like, it is also thinking through security planning and threat modeling. Again, it's like this is a big part of this. It's one thing if you are organizing a protest against a government regime, and another if you are hoping to promote a sidewalk infrastructure in your neighborhood and you're gathering people together and you want to go to the city hall. You know, this is important, and this is activism too. And I think it's good to think through like what your needs are and what your risks are and choose the platform accordingly.
Yeah, again, it all comes back to threat modeling in the end, or risk assessment, or whatever term we're using. Another question from chat. I hear about people being identified in protests presumably through facial recognition and other means. But does anybody know what authorities or other parties do with that information after the fact? So I guess the question is, when people are identified with facial recognition or are identified by social media surveillance companies, what happens with that information?
Well, in Europe, as I mentioned before, activist houses have been raided way after the events of the protests. That data that governments are collecting, it stays there, and they are going to use it if they think it's important to use it. So I don't know if they are going to sell it to others. So this is probably other people are better knowing that. But I can tell you that if someone is actually monitored and is in some kind of list, they will stay in the list, they will be still monitored in months or probably a year time. So that's really bad. But I don't know if maybe Tor and Eva, you also heard other stories about this.
I would just add that governments and law enforcement are not the only threat. That again, one of the big threats that we've really seen come up in the last few years is the use of facial recognition and open source intelligence to de-anonymize people online and then target them with harassment. Just harassment campaigns, sometimes with the threat of violence. Sometimes people come to their house. Sometimes people threaten their children. This is actually one of the ways in which people who are working on sort of election infrastructure right now in the United States are being targeted, and this is one of the things that that the government sort of turns a blind eye to, but is one of the ways in which non-government actors really do a lot to push a chilling effect on people who protest or who speak up.
Great. With one more minute to go, there's one last question in chat that I want to take myself, and that question is there any service that will resist government pressure to pull down video or photo? And the answer to that is simple: no, there's not. You should not assume that any company or open source project maintainer will go to jail or fight in the courts on your behalf. The only person that will be willing to take that risk on your behalf is you, or possibly a family member or a very good friend. But that said, there is a project that I want to plug, which is Open Archive, which will help you securely record and host your own photos or videos in a way where you yourself can resist getting them taken down. So check them out if that's a concern for you. And I'm on the board, which is why I'm plugging them. That said, that is all that we have time for. And that is the end of our live stream time. I want to thank Thorin, Gilo, and Eva so much for joining us today. And I want to thank everybody who just contributed to the discussion in the chat and all of the great questions, and everybody watching at home or at work, or hopefully maybe in the middle of a protest. Thank you all so much for coming today. Digital rights begins with you. EFF has been a leader in privacy, freedom of expression, and innovation for 34 years. And we're able to do that thanks to the support of our members. We're able to stay independent and free from direction from corporate or funder influence. We need your help to keep up that fight. So please consider becoming a member today at eff.org/effectingchange. And also, we have the Electronic Frontier Alliance, which is groups of people that are organizing, perhaps in your city, around local issues and national issues and issues which are relevant to this. So if you want to find a group of like-minded people who are interested in privacy, security, and the other things we've talked about today, check out the Electronic Frontier Alliance, which is at efa.eff.org, I think. Hopefully I got that right. Anyway, we hope you'll all continue these conversations about your civil liberties with your colleagues and friends. Be sure to keep an eye out for the next segments of Effecting Change coming in 2025. Thanks to you all for joining us here, and we'll see you next time.